Hello, my name is Chelsea, and this is a presentation on what happens in the brain with regards to PTSD. It was designed for a third-year psychology course at the University of the Fraser Valley, and since I put so much work into it, I'm going to share it to YouTube. The cause of PTSD is not explainable by a single etiology, but rather a product of multiple interacting factors involving different brain structures and networks, as well as factors involving perception of personal experience. How do we respond to stress? Normally, our stress responses are brief, and the body can deal with physiological and behavioral challenges accordingly, and then the stress response shuts down. Under typical circumstances, cortisol helps us deal with a stressful situation, but if we cannot cope with the stress or the stress is too intense, we will have difficulty shutting down this stress response, and the excessive cortisol can have a negative influence on the brain. On occasion, and as with PTSD and other related anxiety and stress disorders, the brain cannot shut down this stress response, and the body continues to react as though it is still in a stressful state, and it cannot shut down the energy that it is expending. This has serious implications, as excessive stress can alter the nervous system and limbic system plasticity. A study done in 2003 makes the argument that the hippocampus plays a role in turning off the stress response, as its high density of cortisol receptors help to regulate the levels. When levels of stress remain elevated, the excess cortisol can damage the hippocampus, making it unable to reduce the cortisol level. This turns into a vicious cycle in which the hippocampus is getting damaged and cortisol levels are uncontrolled. It is important to note that stress-related hormones and transmitters have a widespread influence on cerebral functioning. With this in mind, it is easy to see the relationship between the regulation of stress, these areas of the brain and their networks, all contribute to the explanation of PTSD. A person with PTSD is having difficulties turning off their stress response. This failure to shut down a stress response is associated with the HPA-axis. As we will be talking a lot about the HPA-axis, let me give you a brief, overgeneralized idea of how that system works and how it contributes to PTSD symptoms. The HPA-axis is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal circuit, which controls production and release of hormones related to stress. Cortisol is a well-established hormone that is secreted by the adrenal glands. When you're stressed, your hypothalamus secretes a hormone that stimulates the pituitary gland to produce ACTH. ACTH, which stands for adrenocorticotropin hormone, is a steroid hormone that is secreted during times of stress. It circulates the bloodstream and stimulates the adrenal gland to produce cortisol. When the HPA-axis is activated, it affects mood, thought, and indirectly the secretion of cortisol by the adrenal glands. In times of stress or trauma in which we cannot cope or deal with the situation, we risk damage to this feedback loop that the brain uses to turn off the stress response. Next, I'll be talking about specific areas in the brain that have been linked to PTSD that are found to have a correlated irregular size and/or activity. These areas are the hippocampus, the amygdala, and the medial prefrontal cortex. The hippocampus, which is involved with learning and memory. There is a correlation between hippocampal size and PTSD, and also with symptoms related to memory. For example, some patients might have difficulty remembering the traumatic event that led to the PTSD, or might not remember it at all. Structural MRI studies have shown reduced hippocampal volume and thinning of the dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex in combat soldiers with PTSD. Low functioning and volume could explain associated symptoms of loss of memory of events. A meta-analysis of structural MRI studies conducted by Michael E. Smith in 2005 showed that on average, people with PTSD have 6.9% smaller left hippocampal volume and 6.6 smaller right hippocampal volume when compared to people without PTSD. Also of note of the study, volume differences were less in control subjects exposed to similar levels of trauma and larger when compared to patients without significant trauma exposure. This suggests that trauma and stressful experiences contribute to hippocampal atrophy. However, further studies in this area would be beneficial. In an article posted to the Journal of Psychiatric Research in 2021, researchers did a study where they compared hippocampal size in monozygotic and dizygotic twins. The study included twins in a family where one brother went to the Vietnam War and developed PTSD and the other brother did not. MRI scans of each set of twins revealed noticeable differences. Twins with Vietnam combat-related PTSD had, on average, 11% smaller right hippocampal volume in comparison to their twin brother who had not gone to war and had not developed PTSD. An interesting outcome from this study was that the researchers found no significant interaction between zygosity. This suggests that there was no predisposing risk factor or genetic effect. Zygosity refers to the degree to which both copies of chromosomes or genes have the same genetic sequence, or how similar their genetic information is. Since identical twins have exactly the same genetic information, if there was a genetic correlation, we would expect to see it stronger between the monozygotic twins, but this was not the case. This study's findings did not support a genetic effect or predisposing factors as an explanation for the smaller hippocampal volume in people living with PTSD. The next brain structure involved in PTSD is the amygdala. The amygdala is responsible for providing context to stimuli, as well as for triggering a stress response. Amygdala responsivity is positively associated with symptom severity in PTSD. In other words, as amygdala activity goes up, so do the severity of the symptoms. This increasing activity makes the amygdala hyper-responsive, hyper meaning over or in excess, and this could explain the associated symptoms of arousal and anxiety. When the amygdala responds to emotional stimuli, it activates the HPA-axis as well as stress hormones, which releases cortisol and adrenaline. This suggests that it may increase HPA-axis activity in some disorders or depression. Excessive activation of the amygdala contributes to many PTSD symptoms, including hypervigilance, intrusive memories, and impaired sleep. The last area I'll be discussing is the prefrontal cortex with respect to the medial and ventromedial prefrontal cortex. We will begin with the medial prefrontal cortex, which is an area of the brain that has a role in cognitive reappraisal and has the ability to reassess danger or threat of emotional stimuli. In a person suffering from PTSD, we might see decreased volume in this area as well as hyporesponsivity, hypo meaning down or under. This is in contrast to the amygdala that becomes hyperresponsive. This could explain symptoms related to anxiety and arousal, as the inability to reappraise an emotional stimulus in a positive way could contribute to high stress level. For example, imagine that you're at home, all alone, and you hear a strange noise. You go to investigate and see a shadow, which terrifies you, and it activates your stress response into flight or fight mode. You quickly realize that it's your friend sneaking in who you forgot was coming over for dinner. You are then able to reappraise your fear and calm down after your brain sends the message to the rest of your body that everything is all good. For a person suffering with PTSD, it is difficult for them to reappraise the emotional stimuli, even after they've realized it's their friend who they forgot was coming over. The medial prefrontal cortex's responsivity is inversely associated with PTSD symptom severity. This means that the more severe the PTSD symptoms, the lower the responsivity of the medial prefrontal cortex. A study done in 2008 found that veterans with PTSD had reduced cortical thickness. They found cortical thickness correlated with memory measures in veterans without PTSD, but not in veterans with PTSD, which led them to believe that the thinning in this region may correspond to functional abnormalities commonly demonstrated in people with PTSD. All of the areas discussed are also involved in the process of fear conditioning and fear extinction. Abnormalities may explain why some people are more likely to develop conditioned fears and may also explain why these symptoms remain in PTSD, as the fear extinction process is not functioning properly. Another interesting study conducted in 2012 found that environment played a role in the development of PTSD for veterans, but only veterans of a certain war. This study found enhanced suppression of cortisol and ACTH was associated with low doses of dexamethasone in veterans that were deployed at the Gulf War. The researchers recruited participants from 3 different war eras: Vietnam, Gulf, and Afghanistan and Iraq. Within these groups, participants were described as war zone exposed veterans with PTSD, war zone exposed veterans without PTSD, and veterans without war zone exposure and without PTSD. The researchers found that veterans from the Gulf War era had differences that separated them from the other veterans from other war eras. They found that, following the CRF, group differences were only evident in the Gulf War cohort. Veterans from that war era that have PTSD displayed higher elevations in ACTH. Most interestingly, the peak change in ACTH was associated with self-reported environmental exposures. In other words, the more environmental exposure to pesticide use that the veterans reported, the higher the elevations in ACTH levels were then observed. Their findings demonstrate that there are persistent alterations in HPA-axis functioning in Gulf War era veterans, specifically which may be a result of environmental exposures that are unique to that war. This may reflect long-term effects of environmental exposures and raises the possibility that there is a unique neuroendocrine profile in this group of veterans. Before we move on, I want to reiterate that the cause of PTSD is not explainable by a single etiology, but rather a product of multiple interacting factors involving different brain structures and networks, as well as factors involving perception of personal experiences. Not everyone who experiences trauma will get PTSD, and not everyone with, let's say, a hyperactive amygdala either has or will get PTSD. More research is needed to provide meaningful insight to the already growing body of research that's working to understand and improve the lives of people living with or experiencing PTSD.